Emma always considered herself a rational person. She didn't believe in the mystical, wasn't interested in the supernatural, and calmly accepted all the stories about ghosts and strange occurrences that her colleagues would sometimes discuss. All of it seemed like childish tales to her. But that evening, late at night, everything changed. Emma was heading home after a long workday, and the exhaustion was evident in every step she took. Her fingers clenched her bag painfully, and her shoulders were slumped from tiredness. It was late, almost midnight, and the building was nearly empty. Only a few lights in the windows illuminated the darkness, and a single dim bulb lit up the corridor. Emma walked down the hall toward the elevator, eagerly thinking how nice it would be to be home. When she approached the old elevator, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It wasn't the newest model, but it still worked. There was nothing strange about her entering alone, as it was usually like that. She didn't even pay attention to the slightly worn doors and the flickering light. She casually pressed the button for her floor. The doors closed, and the elevator slowly began to rise. But then, when she expected to hear the usual movement, the elevator suddenly stopped. Emma didn't notice it right away. She thought it might have been just a glitch, but after a few minutes she began to feel uneasy. The clock on her phone read 12:25. More than 5 minutes had passed, and the elevator was still standing still, as if something was jammed inside. Emma looked at her phone screen. The signal was gone, and she couldn't reach her friend. Deep down, she felt anxious, but decided it was probably just a technical malfunction. She pressed several buttons in a row, trying to summon the elevator to the correct floor, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, she started feeling a strange sense of worry. She looked at herself in the mirror located in the corner of the elevator, trying to calm down and reassure herself. But what she saw in the reflection was unimaginably frightening. At first, it was just a shadow, then a figure, and a few moments later a shape began to materialize from the mirror. He was tall, his face hidden by a hood, and his dark clothing gave him an even more menacing appearance. He stood motionless, like a statue. With every passing moment, Emma felt his presence growing stronger. She tried to turn around to see what was happening with the doors, but her gaze kept returning to the mirror. The shadow became clearer, and within a few seconds, she could already see the features of his face. His eyes were empty, void of any sign of human life. He stood there, as if waiting for her, and Emma felt the terror building within her. The silence in the elevator grew heavier. He didn't move, and his presence was so palpable that it was hard for her to breathe. She tried pressing all the elevator buttons again, hoping that this would help. But the elevator didn't respond. The sounds of her nervous breathing were too loud, and the space around her felt empty, as did her thoughts. "Couldn't you just be obedient?" Emma heard a quiet, almost whispering voice. This voice pierced her mind, leaving behind a faint chill. Every word from this stranger felt like black ice spreading through her veins. Emma's heart began to race, and her fingers tightened around her bag. She felt fear seep into every cell of her body. "Who are you?" She barely managed to ask, her voice trembling. But the stranger didn't answer. He didn't move. His silence was terrifying. Then, as if by magic, the elevator began to move. Emma felt the elevator rising faster, and it seemed like its walls were closing in. The space became tight, and the cold around her turned to ice. The elevator walls began to creak, as if they were old and hadn't been repaired in a long time. But it wasn't just the aging mechanism. Every movement of the elevator felt like an impending threat, a harbinger of something far more terrifying. "You will stay here." That voice sounded again, and in his words, there was something final. He spoke as if Emma could no longer escape her fate. The elevator doors opened onto a floor she didn't recognize. This was not her floor. Emma tried to understand where she was, but everything around her was strangely empty and lifeless. The corridors were dark, and despite the lights, she felt that only darkness surrounded her. She felt her feet step onto a cold floor, unaware that this wasn't her floor. Everything around her felt alien and unfamiliar. The walls were covered in dust, and the doors led to offices that had long been abandoned. Emma's thoughts raced, but they seemed so distant and irrelevant compared to what was happening. Her heart was pounding, and her legs seemed to refuse to move. Emma's steps were hesitant, as though she were walking in a foreign reality. She looked around, and her gaze met the man in the shadow once more. Mia had moved to a new office in one of Manhattan's skyscrapers, and she enjoyed feeling the style and atmosphere of the big city. Unlike her old, rather dull workplace in the suburbs, this one was full of everything new and exciting. Bright lights, the noise of the streets, and the hustle and bustle that filled her days. But the office itself wasn't as modern as she had expected. Mia realized this as soon as she stepped into the building. The elevator was old, clearly not updated in the last 10 years. Its metal walls were covered with scratches and dirt, and the worn-out buttons made a grinding sound when pressed. The buttons themselves had dulled over time, and in the corner of the elevator was a small, strange old rug, which had long since outlived its usefulness. But despite all this, Mia was used to it and continued to use it out of habit, not paying much attention. That day, returning home after a long work day, she noticed that the elevator was empty. It was just an ordinary, unremarkable day, like any other. When the doors closed, Mia glanced at her phone and realized she was the last one on the floor. She reached for the button and pressed the number for her floor, hoping to get home quickly. At first, everything went as usual. The elevator ascended to the desired floor, and the sounds of its old mechanisms were quite familiar. Maya almost relaxed, knowing that she would be in her apartment soon, when suddenly the elevator stopped. Mia flinched as the light in the elevator began to flicker. The delay was unpredictable. She wasn't used to such malfunctions, which made her uneasy. For a moment, she thought it was just a glitch in the mechanism. But then something strange started happening. As soon as the elevator stopped, an unbearable silence settled inside. The usual hum that accompanied the elevator's movement was gone. Mia looked around, but there were no visible changes in the interior. She tried calling reception, but the signal was lost. At that moment, she began to feel a shiver of anxiety. A shadow appeared before her, strange, hanging on the edge of the elevator. Mia tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be the lighting. But when the shadow began to take the form of a person, her heart froze. He stood in the corner of the elevator, motionless. His face was hidden beneath a hood. Mia could only make out his silhouette. He was tall, with long arms, and his expression was strange, as if he was in some sort of closed posture. "Could you come with me?" The voice sounded desperate, yet eerie. Mia felt her throat tighten, and suddenly a wave of cold ran over her skin. It felt as if this person was anything but ordinary. Her fear intensified, but instead of saying anything, Mia froze in place. She couldn't understand what was happening, and that sense of unease only grew stronger. He didn't move. He simply stood there, watching her from beneath the hood. Mia felt her heart beat faster, and her breathing became heavier. She grabbed the elevator's handle and frantically pressed all the buttons, hoping that at least something would change. But the elevator remained still. The shadow in the corner became clearer, and now, when Mia looked toward it, she could make out his face. It was not a human face. It was blurry, like it was smeared with shadow, and when their eyes met, Mia felt as if the world around her was slowly disappearing. Every detail in the elevator became more and more blurry. "You won't be able to escape," he said, and his voice grew harsher, though there was an indescribable sadness in it. At that moment, the elevator began to move again, but this was not a normal movement. The elevator started descending, and with each meter they descended, Mia felt an unimaginable pull, dragging her downward. The walls of the elevator felt suffocating, and the air became heavier. She felt as though she were being strangled by this sensation, as if the elevator was not just a means of transport, but a place for prisoners. "You won't escape from here," the stranger repeated when the elevator finally reached the lower floor. But what struck Mia was that this floor was empty, as though it didn't exist at all. There were no signs of movement on the floor of the elevator, and she noticed that the doors opened not onto her usual floor. It was not her home. When the elevator doors opened, Mia felt an overwhelming fear. The corridor she found herself in was completely dark. The walls appeared to be hidden behind a thick layer of dust, and the air was filled with the smell of old iron. A strange feeling of loss and emptiness gripped her. Everything here felt so alien. She wanted to turn back and get back into the elevator, but the doors immediately closed. A flash of fear crossed her eyes. He was standing there, and his shadow was drawing nearer. He approached her, and there was nothing human in his face. "You're with me now, forever." Emily had always been a person who didn't believe in the supernatural. She was used to being rational, explaining everything logically and viewing the world through the lens of facts. But what happened to her one evening made her doubt her own perception of reality. It was already late. Emily had stayed at work, finishing reports and fixing errors in a project that had to be ready by morning. She wasn't overly tired, but the evening had drained her. When she finally closed her laptop and was ready to go home, her colleagues had already left. The building was empty, and Emily could hear every step echo in the silence of the corridors. In that moment, she realized how much she missed the usual city hustle and the people around her. Everything was so quiet, it felt a little scary. The office building was old, and the elevator she was taking down was one of the oldest she had ever seen. The elevator doors creaked, and when it moved, it seemed as though every mechanism inside was on the verge of breaking. But still, she entered, as there was no other way. She pressed the button and waited for the usual descent. The elevator began moving, and Emily felt her body shift slightly with each movement of the cabin. At first, everything went as usual, but after a while, when she pressed the button for her floor, the elevator suddenly stopped. The walls squeezed in, and for a moment, the world around her felt too tight. Emily looked at the display. It didn't show any movement. She pressed the button several times, but nothing happened. She couldn't help but notice how strangely quiet the elevator had become. Even the sounds of movement had ceased, and the air was filled with an ominous emptiness. Emily looked around. There was no dust in the corners of the elevator, but its interior was worn and looked as if it hadn't been updated in decades. She glanced at the mirror on one of the walls and suddenly noticed that her reflection didn't match reality. She saw a man. He was standing right behind her. His face was blurry, like a distorted image. He wasn't moving, just standing there, and his eyes were looking into the mirror, as if he were part of her reflection. Emily didn't immediately realize that this man wasn't actually in the elevator with her. He was a stranger, and his presence filled her with intense unease. He looked strange, dressed in dark clothes, with a lean body and a tense posture. Emily tried to turn around, but her body seemed to disobey her. She clenched her fists, trying to force herself to regain control. But the face of this stranger stayed in her line of sight, despite her looking at the walls of the elevator. His eyes were filled with something she couldn't define. Perhaps it was the gaze of someone who had no soul or mind, only emptiness. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but so close that it felt like he was right next to her. "You're not leaving here," the stranger said. His words carried a desperate urgency, and Emily felt her heart tighten with fear. His voice held not only a threat, but also a sense of desperation, as if he wasn't just an ominous stranger, but some kind of being who couldn't leave until he fulfilled his purpose. Emily couldn't breathe. The elevator wasn't moving, and the silence became unbearable. She pressed the buttons again, but nothing happened. Silently, she stood there, trying to understand what was happening. But her mind was overwhelmed with the feeling that the elevator wasn't just a means of moving between floors. It was a place beyond ordinary reality, as if time and space no longer obeyed logic. "You won't be able to leave," he said, as if this were not a threat, but an inevitability. Emily felt her hands start to tremble. She didn't know what to do. She had no way out. The elevator wasn't moving, and the man, whose face kept distorting in the mirror, wasn't disappearing. She looked into the mirror again, and this time, his face became clear. It was distorted, like someone who had long outlived death, and his face was filled with pain and fear. "What do you want?" Emily could barely speak, her voice barely audible. "You can't leave because you're already here. You don't understand, but you've become part of this." At that moment, the elevator began moving again, but this was not the usual downward movement. The elevator seemed to slowly turn into another place, another dimension. Emily felt the air around her become heavy, as if something invisible and eerie surrounded her. She tried to turn and find an exit, but the elevator doors suddenly slammed shut, and everything turned dark. Then she understood that this stranger was part of her reality. He wasn't just a person. He was something more. He was part of something that she couldn't comprehend. And now, as she found herself in this place, she knew she could never leave.